Commissioner, thank you very much for talking to Cyprus News Agency. Following your contacts in the island the past week, if you had to rate Cyprus in terms of human rights, what would the overall score be?
I don't rate countries, I try to help them. I try to help them by identifying gaps, shortcomings, areas where they could do more, be more ambitious, and accomplish more. When I look at migration, I would say that Cyprus stands out in a number of realms. One, the figures of asylum seekers arriving are not that big. The biggest gap seems to be on integration measures. People wait a long time to get some kind of status, even longer to get citizenship if they get refugee status. And there seems to be very little provision for services, support, language training, integration measures of various kinds. Mm-hmm. I think especially in light of the fact that more arrivals are very likely. In fact, they're coming with the relocation of the 275 from Greece, that Cyprus should give much more thought to investing in integration. It's a good investment. It will pay back. I think another area where Cyprus stands out is it doesn't give refugee status to many people. It gives subsidiary protection. This is not the norm in most of Europe. Most of Europe gives far more refugee status to people rather than subsidiary protection. What does that mean? That means that people have fewer rights and their situation is not quite as stable. Fewer rights with regard to family reunification. I think we have to acknowledge the fact that people from Syria and elsewhere, they're not going to return home in the near future. So they need some kind of a stable prospect of making a life for themselves elsewhere. With regard to the other facilities, I was struck by the fact that Kofino, the reception center, it's not a bad facility by the standard of such facilities, but it's very isolated from very far from many populated centers, and this does not facilitate integration. Mm-hmm. The other thing is it seems to be run almost solely on EU funds, and EU funds and projects are good for supplementing policy, but they shouldn't replace policy.
Yes, but we're in Cyprus. We had the impact of the financial crisis. Public finances are perhaps cannot be spent in the same extent as before. How can a country cope?
Well, exactly. The figures are not big in terms of migrants and asylum seekers, which means it should be manageable. It should be manageable in terms of funding for these facilities. It should be manageable in terms of staffing for these facilities. If other countries are managing with far greater numbers, then I think Cyprus can manage even in the current economic constraints with these small numbers. One thing that struck me as well, I went to Manoia detention facility, and these facilities are never happy places anywhere. But it seems to me that very little thought is given to alternatives to detention. Bail, house arrest, reporting regularly to the authorities, measures such as these. And when I asked the various ministers involved, I didn't get a clear answer why they're not developing these alternatives.
You said recently that governments should carry out systematic human rights and screening of the budget and the fiscal policy. Mm-hmm. And you just talked with the finance minister. I was wondering, how's the government faring in this respect overall?
Well, I think overall it's doing relatively well. I was quite struck by the introduction of this guaranteed minimum income scheme, which appears to be working relatively well after a very slow start and some hiccups in the beginning. The people I met with, NGOs and academics, they said on paper it looks very good, but the implementation was quite problematic. And the Minister of Finance acknowledged this. He said there was a backlog. And now we've gone through it, and now the system should work much better. I heard complaints about the complexity of the process, so I urged a review of the criteria so that people who are really in need can access it. But it seems to be a good way to make sure that nobody falls through the cracks in these very difficult times. What's interesting is the most vulnerable groups here are slightly different than the vulnerable groups I've seen in other countries undergoing crisis. Here, there seems to be consensus that several groups were hit hardest. Single-parent families, particularly single women with children, migrants and migrant children. And then the third group was mentioned to me by the Minister of Finance, middle-aged persons with dependents who might be unemployed, have mortgages, and so on. And I met some people in that situation as well. In other contexts, you see that pensioners were disproportionately hit, or that women were very hard hit, and women have been hit here, especially the single mothers. But we haven't seen the kind of spike in child poverty that I've seen in places like Spain, or kind of abuse and neglect of older persons. Child poverty here?
Yes.
Yes, I mean precisely these children of single mothers or children of migrants apparently are in a very difficult situation.
You said yesterday in a statement that European countries' handling of the refugee crisis was simply disastrous. And you urge for safe passage, for access to asylum, and you also, more recently, you called for a serious review of the Dublin regulation. I was wondering, what is the solution in your view regarding this problem? Is it a solution to make it easier for refugees to come to Europe? Would that solve everything?
I think that would stop the chaotic arrivals of people and the protests at borders and the building of fences. And I think there's a need to really ramp up resettlements from areas surrounding Syria, from Turkey, from Jordan, from Lebanon. These people are on the move, and regardless of how much money the EU pays Turkey, Turkey will not be able to keep these people from moving, and at least not in a human rights compliant way. So these people will move. Why not save them the thousands of euros they pay smugglers, the difficult journeys in which children and women die or become traumatized on the way, the being shuttled back and forth between countries until one finally assumes responsibility? Why not resettle them in larger numbers from these areas if it's clear that they're going to come and we're going to give them protection anyway? So resettlement I see as one big area of that could help address this issue in the medium to long term. The second issue is, of course, legal venues to reach Europe, such as family reunification, such as humanitarian visas, such as various other kinds of visas, if we're going to give them protection when they arrive. If it's clear, all the research suggests that family reunification is essential for integration to happen. How can you integrate if your child or your wife or your husband is somewhere being bombed, being tortured, and so on? So it's clear that these issues are interlinked, and family reunification is also one of the ways to move forward. Regarding Dublin, it's clear to me that the system has virtually collapsed. I was just in Hungary not so long ago. I was in Germany not so long ago. And Dublin returns aren't happening to many countries. This system is not working. It put unsustainable pressures on a couple of frontline countries. So it's clear that there needs to be some kind of a rule-based solidarity across Europe. But the only way that relocations, which is one form of rule-based solidarity, will work is, one, if family ties are taken into account. Otherwise, people will move to where their families are. And the second is if there's further harmonization of integration supports and standards. If you can go to Germany or Sweden and know that you will get so many hours of language training, vocational training, housing support, and you go to another country and you know that you'll get nothing there, it's clear that you're going to go to the country that gives you support. So there needs to be further harmonization here.
Only yesterday, the Council of Europe has reiterated Turkey's unconditional obligation to pay just satisfaction for the court has awarded in a number of cases. We have human rights violations on the part of Turkey for on missing persons, on properties in the Turkish occupied part of Cyprus. But it seems that there is little progress so far on the part of Turkey. What is missing? Do we need to apply more pressure? And what would your message be to Ankara?
My message is implementation of judgments of the European Court of Human Rights is not non-implementation is not an option if you want to remain a member in full standing. And this I say to all countries. These judgments must be implemented. You cannot have a system in which countries cherry pick that this judgment I will implement and this one I will not. Otherwise the whole system falls apart. My hope, and the sense I got from my discussions, was that some of these issues might see some progress in the coming months and years if a settlement is reached. That there's been some movement on the issue of missing persons, opening up of 30 sites in military areas, which I find very hopeful, which I welcome very much, and this was a step by Turkey. But it's clear that Turkey has to move forward and implement these judgments fully. And I'm hoping that in the context of the settlement that this will happen.
And what about press freedom in Turkey? We've seen recently new cases of journalists being detained, Can Dündar, Erdem Gül. How does this situation worry you?
I'm quite alarmed by a number of trends in Turkey. I hope to go there early next year to do some more work on issues pertaining to freedom of expression, as well as counterterrorism and human rights and independence of the judiciary. This has been an issue of concern for some time to the Council of Europe, and we've raised it, and there are many cases before the European Court of Human Rights, not only of insulting the president, but various people who have run afoul of the counterterrorism legislation. So it's a grave concern, and it's an issue that I've engaged in quite a bit in my statements in recent months. But I'll have more to say after I go to Turkey in the near future.
Commissioner, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.